to talk today about Alfred Adler and this new chapter. So I've told you guys, and I'm not going to lie or be ashamed of it, I haven't taught personality before, other than, you cover it a bit here and there, especially in intro psych. It's been a while since I've explored some of this myself, to be perfectly honest with you. And I kind of have forgotten about Adler, which is really the case in psychology. That we just tend to overlook Alfred Adler, and he was a cool dude. So I want to share some of you with some of his basic stuff with you, and hopefully you'll agree that we kind of shamefully sort of overlook Alfred Adler. All right, so here's my little 30-second introduction to
Vienna-born Alfred Adler was another former collaborator of Freud who struck out on his own. Adler agreed with Freud that childhood was important, but he emphasized ongoing social tensions, not sexual ones, as most crucial to the formation of personality. He coined the term inferiority complex and believed that much of our adult behavior is linked to childhood struggles with feeling inferior. In the end, not all of their theories have endured, but Freud and his contemporaries were key to the evolution of psychoanalytic theory because they explored ways in which our mental life and personality may be submerged beneath the veil of consciousness. But the psychoanalytical approach is only one perspective on what makes us who we are.
Yes, and that's in the middle of what we're doing here. So Freud and the so-called neo-Freudians. Adler was a contemporary of Freud. He was not a student or a disciple of Freud. They were, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know Freud's years offhand, but I believe Adler was older. Freud was younger than Adler. So Adler even apparently bristled at being, apparently he was, towards the end of his life and career, he was being, regarded as a disciple of Freud. And they were more contemporaries than one, being dominant over the other. And in fact, they had a pretty bitter falling out because, well, if you didn't agree with Freud, you had a bitter falling out with Freud. He had no patience or time, apparently, for people who did not agree with him. And Adler apparently was a little bit on that sort of egotistical side as well. And they apparently had one of those sort of bitter fallings out, like Carl Jung also had with Freud. So there's some commonalities with Freud and Adler, but there's enough differences to make Adler really interesting, I think. So in many ways, he sort of adapted, and he was very flexible, as you're going to see. You can, when you talk about Adler, you can talk about early Adler or late Adler, because they were like almost different psychologists. But what he sort of latched onto with Freud, and by the way, in addition to the misconception that he was sort of a disciple of Freud, there's also the misconception that he borrowed, or he borrowed from Freud, and it was almost equally the other way around. Freud incorporated a lot of Adler's stuff. And, being an egotistical guy that he was, sort of called it his own. But, anyway, my point was that we talked already about Freud and his strengths and mostly weaknesses, and Adler kind of latches onto some of the best of Freud and dropped some of the, the best of Freud, the worst of Freud, okay? So, now just as with Freud, it's interesting to look at their own lives and personalities and just think about and discuss how that probably or very likely shaped their thoughts on personality and their own contributions to psychology. Full well. We learned a lot about Freud's early life. Adler's early life too is interesting, and you can definitely see the parallels between his life and how it shaped his thinking. So Adler, revealed how he was very, he had this, as growing up, he felt very inferior. He was a sickly kind of guy. He had rickets as a kid, which was a bone disease, and he was, as we're going to see today, he was in the middle of his family. He had an older brother in particular that, we're going to see Adler had all kinds of interesting thoughts about birth order and how that contributes to your personality. And so we can see all that, these feelings of physical inferiority, his feelings of mental inferiority, especially compared to his older sibling, and then it winds up shaping his ideas about a so-called inferiority complex, which I'll talk about. So yeah, he had this physical and sort of psychological feelings of inferiority. He also had this, so one of the things he borrowed from Freud was this interest in early experiences. We know full well now that Freud really latched onto the early experiences, and as I explained to you, he claimed that your personality is pretty much fully formed as you by the time you're about 5. You're all 3 of those components, id, ego, superego, are all established, developed by the time you're about 5, and they just so the rest of your life is sort of like an extension of that 5-year-old. Adler's sort of, when you read him, he's a little bit conflicting because he's talking about the importance of early experiences, but then also talking about how your life experiences after that will certainly shape and guide your personality. So which is it? Is he a subscriber to this notion of, early childhood experiences like Freud, or not? So he is a little bit of both. But so anyway, I'll be talking about this. His inferiority ideas and superiority and the conflicts, and then also his so-called his what he called style of life. We'll try to make sense of what he termed a style of life, and this big concept of social interest. Okay, so. In the meanwhile, we'll talk about birth order, and today we'll do an activity having to do with birth order, in fact. So, okay. And I hope to talk a little bit about some, what do we say today, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Adler, his other contributions today, how they persist, and how maybe ones that don't. And then research. Hopefully we have time to talk a little bit about the research that does actually, lend some support, especially to his ideas about birth order. Okay, so one of the early childhood experiences that also kind of reveals interesting thing about Adler and his ideas about that was, he, like Freud, Freud was very interested in these early childhood experiences. He was very interested in hearing, his patients talk about those experiences, share their innermost thoughts and feelings, and share their dreams and interpret their dreams, and so there's a lot about, obviously a lot about interviewing and listening to the patient. So Adler, of course, espoused a therapy that was similarly about listening to experiences, listening to your own experience, reflecting upon your own past. And to him, it didn't matter so much if you were having accurate, real memories of your earlier life, or if these were just sort of made-up fantasies or misremembrances or just false memories. So, as an example, he tells stories about how he had, as a child, this, how he was developing this inferiority complex notion that, as we're going to see, personality is based very, very heavily, largely on everybody's feelings of inferiority. The other day, I commented upon, I kind of challenged you to give me examples of things that you do, anything that you do that is not ultimately motivated somewhere by fear. Adler could probably do the same thing and challenge you to say, like, anything that you do that's not immediately motivated by your feelings of inferiority. All right, so kind of that's a similar sort of idea. So anyway, he as he was reflecting upon inferiority and developing those ideas, he thought about it in himself, and he thought back when he was a child, how he, like everybody, had feelings of inferiority about life, about living, and fear of death, and how that contributes to a feeling of inferiority. I have an inferiority complex about saying inferior now. So as a child, he was remembering how when he would walk to school, this fear of death would really get exacerbated by having to walk through a cemetery on his way to school. And then he remembered that as a child he decided one day he was going to run a certain number of times back and forth through that cemetery on his way to school in an attempt to sort of just break out of that fear of it, just to overexpose himself to the cemetery and be done with it, and that it worked. And that from then on he never had a fear of the cemetery and subsequently a fear of death. Interesting, funny story to think about that. Okay, you know, as a grown old man, he's thinking about this as a you know, maybe 5 or 6 or 8 year old or something. Okay, well, for whatever reason, he spoke with other old former classmates of his who also went to that school, and in the process of discussing this phenomenon with them, they would say things like, "I don't remember a cemetery." One after another would report, "There was no cemetery there," and it turned out there was no cemetery there. So where the hell did this story come from? Okay, it didn't matter to Adler. It was like, well, that must obviously that doesn't. It doesn't. So that was kind of his thing. You know, a good example of how he thought about reflecting upon your early experiencing or listening to a patient. Doesn't matter if you or they are telling the truth or are accurate or having a false memory. It's, you know, it's revealing what's. It's about revealing what's going on in your, you know, levels of consciousness. Okay, so that's kind of neat. You know, that he was just sort of like, meh, all right, so I made it up. Big deal. It still reveals something interesting about feeling inferior about death. Okay, so interesting guy. All right. So he similar to, you know, he has some parallels with Freud. So he decided early on he wanted to be a doctor. Being sickly, he said that he remembers hearing a doctor tell his father that essentially he wasn't going to make it. That's it for your son, or something like that. You know, and he again had this older brother who was robust and healthy and an athlete and, you know, smarter and everything in his mind. And here he is, a sickly child with a doctor telling, you know, he can overhear the doctor telling his father basically that he's going to die. And he says that's what motivated him to become a doctor himself. All right, so taking that feeling of inferior, like what could be a more inferior feeling than thinking like, I'm so sickly I'm going to die, and the experts around me are preparing my family for my death. Okay, to make him, you know, that was his own little personal challenge. I'm going to live, and I'm going to be a doctor myself. So he says that was his sort of inspiration or motivation to become a doctor. Okay. Whether or not that's a true story, you know, when you hear that he was mistaken about another earlier memory, who knows? But interesting little tidbit about his life. Okay. So again, he wasn't a disciple or a follower of Freud. They got together, they talked about issues and things, and they had things that they agreed about. They had things that they disagreed about. Like I said, you know, they were both pretty strong personalities eventually. Adler a little bit more, and Freud kind of always a strong personality. And yeah, you know, when there was disagreements, it led to a falling out. Okay, so he would be critical of Freud's ideas and theories, and yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this inferiority complex or drive that's, he says, within all of us. Now, there's different responses that you can have to this, as we're going to see. So he said that this was a very normal component. This is, again, everybody has feelings of inferiority. How we respond to that dictates and determines our personality. Okay, so of course we're not all going to respond the same way to that sort of challenge that we all are faced with, the feelings of inferiority. We all have things that we're going to feel inferior about. And again, with Adler, it wasn't, you know, there's things that you probably look and reflect upon that you obviously feel inferior about, but he says that there's virtually everything that you feel inferior about anything and everything. Some things that you are very conscious about, some things that you're maybe only a little aware of, and other things that you're completely unaware of that are motivating you to deal, and how you deal with those feelings dictates and shapes your personality. Okay, so you compensate. Now, again, some of this is going to sound like, hey, I've heard these terms, inferiority complex, compensating. overcompensating. These are things like Freud that, terms that enter our culture, enter our normal everyday language. Referring to somebody overcompensating for something. Okay, so yes, that's one indeed reaction that some people have, is not just compensating for something that they feel inferior about, but overcompensating for it. Okay, indeed, swinging in the complete other direction, so that you then wind up having what he'd call a superiority complex. You feel superior over others. Which he would say is ultimately always motivated by your feelings of feeling inferior. Okay? So, kind of similar, it sounds a lot like Freud's ideas, right? I think when I hear that about that reaction formation defense mechanism, how we are really truly feeling the opposite of what we are professing. If we say we love someone, we hate them. When we say we hate something or someone, we actually love it. The superiority complex is something, sounds a lot like that to me. So overcompensating for a feeling of inferiority, and then trying to be really dominant and aggressive about it with others. Okay. So like Freud, this stuff starts in infancy. So he shares that with Freud quite a bit, but not to the same degree as Freud. So like I was saying earlier, Adler's a little bit all over the place. Sometimes it sounds like he's completely rejecting this notion of early experience, and other times he's saying, no, your early experience does indeed shape your personality forever. So he's a little bit inconsistent and sometimes hard to figure out there. And it doesn't just vary between like early Adler and late life Adler. Okay, there's definitely a difference between the two. But even when you look at early Adler and late Adler, you'll see inconsistencies there as well. So that's one of the criticisms of Adler. It's like, well, which is it? What is it? Do early life infancy experiences matter or not? Okay. All right. So, you have this complete dependency on adults. You're completely inferior. So it just that also matches his idea that that's not terribly surprising. That's not really hard to wrap your head up. That doesn't sound very, why shouldn't a baby feel inferior if they can't do much, okay? They're completely dependent on the adults around them. Okay, so you have this superiority complex and an inferiority complex. And of course, some people will have both. You have things that you have inferiority complexes about. You perhaps have compensated and maybe become really skilled or learned how to do something really well. Maybe you've really educated yourself. Maybe you've become a really good athlete. Maybe you've become a really good performer. Maybe you became what you think you're a really good lover. Okay, so ultimately all of these things are motivated by, fear of being inferior in those things, and you compensate it somehow. So yes, you can wind up having inferiority complexes and superiority complexes, and then of course you kind of, for many and most things, you're probably bopping back and forth in the middle, somewhere in the middle. Okay? So, these probably don't need a heck of a lot of explanation. An inferiority complex is going to develop when you feel unsure about something, when you feel you are unable to compensate for some normal feeling of inadequacy in some component of life. Okay? On the other hand, a superiority complex is going to arise when you are figuring out ways to sort of to compensate for that weakness. Okay? Adler describes how, yes, sickly, weak child, doctors saying that he's going to die, to, pushing himself to, in physical ways too, not just in, becoming a doctor, and not just in mental, cognitive ways, but he kind of, said, I'm going to go, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to try, I'm going to be, get healthier, I'm going to become a better athlete and stuff like that. So he, somebody who can take a weakness and develop it into a strength, he would say has swung over to the superiority complex. These things, by the way, don't need to be as judgmental as they sound. Okay, when you say somebody has, when you say somebody has either one of these complexes, you probably don't typically mean it as some sort of compliment. Okay, it's not usually regarded that. We're right in everyday language, we don't think of that as like, we'd say it sarcastically if we said it. Okay, but he didn't, you know, to him it wasn't necessarily a put down in either direction. It was just a reality. That's just how it works. If you got really good at something, it was because, well, ultimately you were just really felt inadequate at it. Okay? Whether or not you ever acknowledge that or are aware of it, you know, again, he's bopping in and out of Freud's levels of consciousness in discussing this. Of course, some things we're aware of. You know, he's reflecting about how, yeah, I think I was really afraid of death when I was a little kid, or whatever. I mean, I remember that story about the doctor, you know, saying I was going to die. Okay, some things you're aware of, and you know, he decided I'm going to overcome this and with full awareness. And other things are completely that you're not aware of. So you might not have ever realized that you had, you know, the motivation. You never realized that you were weak in that in the first place. So somebody with a superiority complex is not necessarily aware of the fact that it's ultimately stemmed by a feeling of weakness and inadequacy. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So it's not, again, necessarily a dig or a, you know. Okay. All right. You know, this just all kind of just reminded me of one of my favorite shows, Big Bang Theory. So I got to play you a clip. How many of you are Big Bang fans? None of you? One of you? Two of you? Big Bang Theory? Come on, raise your hand. Okay, all right, there's got to be more of you out there. All right, so I don't really want to overdevelop this. You know, if you've never seen the show, you don't know who these characters are. They're a bunch of nerds that are friends, and a couple of them are roommates, and one of them has got this just absolute superiority complex. Sheldon, he's a brilliant, but you know, probably really high on the autistic spectrum, you're gonna see. So this has got two things that I like. So anyway, we're gonna see the Sheldon's superiority complex in the first part of this clip, and then I'm going to just let it play because then it just blends into something else we're going to pick up at a much later chapter. We have a chapter on behavioral theories of personality, of how we're shaped by experiences, rewards, and punishments. And so I'm going to let it blend, I'm going to let it play into like this wonderful, very funny example of of operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Okay. Oops, I didn't mean to. Okay. I hope you enjoyed that. A little lengthy, but all right. So you can clearly see the inferiority complexes going on in the other two characters, and Sheldon's superiority complex, and then a good deal of classical and operant conditioning going on there. Okay. So anyway, any thoughts or questions so far? Well, where do these inferiority complexes come from? He had three sorts of theories about how they do arise. So what he called organic inferiority, I can't even say that word, organic inferiority. These would be sort of like physical things that, like in his own case, his early weakness and illness as a child. Okay, being, if you're feeling inferior by your shortness or your tallness or your weight or your looks or whatever, so something that you biologically inherit. Okay, so those are what he would refer to as organic causes of inferiority. Spoiling or pampering by adults or other siblings or caretakers would be something that helps contribute to an inferiority. So you just don't learn how to, deal and cope and adjust to life on your own because somebody's always there, helping you through every potential hurdle, right? And neglect. So of course, obviously neglect, and that probably doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. So almost the opposite of spoiling and pampering, you got neglect on that side can lead to inferiority. So, a child who's continually neglected by those same people, okay? All right. So I'm going to skip that. All right. Let me try to make sense of what he called style of life. And in some ways, this could just be like a substitute for the term personality. So your personality is what he referred to as your style of life. So how do these things start to come together to create your personality, your style of life? And so this is one of the many ways where he began to deviate from Freud. So Adler's thinking is a heck of a lot more optimistic and less pessimistic than Freud's, less cynical, and again less like fixed by the time you're 5. That your experiences throughout life are going to continually shape your style of life. So this is going to vary and differ not only from person to person, but from throughout your life. Your style of life gets shaped by the experience that you have. So you are influenced by your social interactions. Now Freud said you were shaped by the time at infancy, and by the time by the time you're about 5, you're like your socialization already shaped those components of your personality. Okay. Adler differed and disagreed, said, no, this happens throughout life. So he talked a lot about social interaction, which, by the way, is, another sort of, like I mentioned earlier, that Adler is not, he's overlooked by so many psychologists, I think. I mean, I think we tend as a discipline to sort of like ignore him and not recognize some of these contributions. Some of those contributions got misattributed to others, like, Freud got the credit for some of the things that Adler came up with. Jung got the credit for some of the things that Adler came up with. And many of the things that Adler came up that we know full well that Adler came up with, we just kind of ignore or forget or just disregard. So like one area that he just had a profound influence on, it's not just, of course, personalities in every intro, personality course, but social psychology. Many consider Adler to be one of the fathers of social psychology as a discipline. Nobody ever, we wouldn't argue, you will probably never otherwise hear Adler referred to as a social psychologist, but in many ways he kind of was. Because of all this, your personality is shaped by your social interactions, okay? Not just your actual interactions, but your, social psychology, just to refresh your memory, is in a nutshell, is the study of the effect that the real or even the imagined presence of others has on your behavior, opinions, thoughts, etc. Okay? That, or the imagined presence is a really key thing that often gets overlooked when you talk about social psychology. Of course, people say, oh, the effect that others have on your behavior. Okay? Not just when they're around you, but even just when they're not around you. When you are imagining their presence. When you think about how, if you think about your parents when you make decisions, even when they're not around, when you grow up, and trust me, like, your parent, to this day, I'm still, like, often thinking, like, what would my dad think of this? So that doesn't go away, people. So yeah, when you dream, you are imagining the presence of others, and so your dreams have an influence on you. So it's really interesting that Adler got this connection to social psychology, because it's not just about the interactions that you are physically having with people, but the thoughts of other people affect your socialization and interactions. Okay, so that's interesting stuff, I think. Okay. So you have this, what he called creative power of self that differed largely from Freud again. So Freud's all deterministic, and it's all unconscious, and it's all preformed in the early ages of your life. So Adler recognized this creative power that you do have to shape your own style of life as you go along. You're not locked in, even to that stuff that you are. And again, Adler's all over the place. So one moment he's talking about like, hey, early influences, infancy. Then the next day he's talking about, you can shape all that. So you you can be a little bit, which one is he? All right. So anyway, a little bit more about these styles of life. He talked about 4 styles of life that people tend to sort of fall into. This is not a very good slide. I'm sorry, I don't like this one. It's got the labels, but I don't. The one where little sub labels aren't terribly helpful. So I have to make this better. But anyway, the four styles are dominant, avoiding, getting, and socially useful. Let me try to explain briefly better than these single words describe what they mean. Okay. Somebody who has a dominant style of life is somebody who's dominant. Somebody who's going to be probably a little bit more on the superiority complex side of things, and compensating, if not overcompensating, for those weaknesses and inferiorities. They're going to be, these are people that are going to be dominant in situations. They're going to be extroverted people. They're going to be forceful. They're going to be sometimes crossing that delicate line between being assertive and aggressive, between being arrogant and confident. Okay, so that kind of makes I think that one's a little bit easy to understand. So a dominant style of life. Okay, and again, everything's motivated ultimately with Adler stemming from inferiority. Okay. All right, the avoiding style of life is somebody that does not confront, somebody that does not face those feelings of inadequacy all the time or very well at all. Somebody who would give up relatively or very easily when confronted with their own thoughts or examples of weaknesses. So they're going to be the kind of people that are going to ignore the problems that pop up. Again, stemming from because of inferiorities. Everything's about inferiorities with Adler. Everything. Okay, so no matter how dominant you are, it's ultimately motivated by feelings of inferiority. No matter how much you are the opposite, avoiding all the confrontations and addressing issues, again, it's, very obviously stemming from inferiority complexes. All right, most of us, he says, are in the getting category. Okay, and this is a little bit cynical sounding. It's a lot cynical sounding. Okay, just the word getting kind of sounds like most of us are getters. All right, what does that mean? It means that we're just trying to always we're dependent on others, okay, to help us deal with life. And if you if you stop and think about it, you have to admit how true that really is. Think how much even though, no matter how independent you think you are, no matter how dominant if you're sitting up listening to these four and thinking, you know what, I am more dominant or I am more avoiding, these are not all, again, these are not like you're one or the other and you're never the other, okay? We go flowing back and forth through these, of course, but you'd say we all have a disposition to be mostly one of these things, okay? And of course, we go from situation to situation and slide back and forth. But aren't we all trying to get something from somebody, from other people? We're all, from early on, you can immediately, like I just said, when you're an infant, of course it's about getting. If you don't get, you die, okay? But from then on, it's about, right, we want friends so that we can get something out of a friendship. We want lovers so that we get something out of being in love. We go to school to get. We go to work to get. Okay? So, getting is most of us. I think you'd have to agree with Adler on that. This is a very dominant style of life. This is a very key component of your personality. Working to overcompensate, to just compensate or overcompensate for things that you need, okay? We all fear dying. We all want to eat. We all want to drink. We want shelter. We want all the basics, the biological things, of course. We'll work to get, to stay alive in the first place. But then we will, we want from others the things. Think about how much your happiness, and again, side conversation about how we don't know a damn thing about what makes us happy, but think how important other people are, how we make, let me start that all over again. Think how important we make other people for making ourselves happy. It's about getting. You'd have to agree with that, I think. Okay? We have, in just about any of our social interactions are about, again, this is a little cynical, Some of this psychoanalytical stuff is very cynical. It's about, selfishly getting a little bit of that, a lot of that id, at work here, just getting what we want and need. All right? So, the part that makes us very dependent upon others. Okay, and again, that's most of us and most of the time. All right. The last category, the last style of life is what he called socially. Now again, Adler is writing, I think, I'm not positive, in German. So everything I'm talking about are English translations of things. He didn't anyway. So I don't know what his term was, but it would translate most commonly to socially useful. Okay. This reminds me, before I explain what it is, this reminds me of Maslow's hierarchy. Everybody in psychology, I think, has at least some awareness of Maslow's levels of hierarchy. Our needs, our most basic biological needs at the bottom need to be met before we work on satisfying more and more advanced needs. And at the very top, we have that self-actualization, where we're motivated for not rewards and recognition and all of the getting kind of category stuff. To me, the socially useful sounds a lot like the people at the top of the pyramid, where they're not just working to better and enhance themselves, but to enhance the world they live in, the future world they will never live in. Okay, so that's this is the land of Adler's socially useful category. So this is you cooperating to not just better yourself, but to better the people around you, the people dependent upon you, and the people that will, that again, if you think even much more globally about it, not just in your lifetime and your immediate, your children, your lovers, your spouses, your brothers, your sisters, your family, your not even just your community, but if you're working, I'm recycling because I think the world should have, I'm not even worried about, necessarily my own offspring. I just want the world to be a better place, okay? So that's where these kinds of motivations reside. Socially useful sorts of personality components. Does that make sense? This is kind of neat. This is neat stuff. Kind of neat stuff to break it up into these four. Very interesting. This is very like and very unlike anything else, I think, that we're going to explore this semester. This is commonalities, like I'm trying to point out here and there, but it's also just, in a way, thoroughly unique. Okay? All right. Hit me up if you got any questions along the way. I'm doing all the talking. Now, kind of this is related to, but not just socially useful category that I'm going into now. This is all of these areas and how what he called social interest has to do with all of this. Okay, so yes, social interest is part of that socially useful category. Yes, but not entirely. Your social interest, runs throughout all four of those styles of you. All right, so we have this is again sort of where you're like, where he's kind of like Freud, but very much different from Freud at the same time. You have he says you have an innate potential to cooperate with other people. That's a little bit like, but a little bit unlike Freud in many ways. The id is not about cooperating at all. The id is about me. And Adler comes along and says, you have this innate component, but it's also an innate component to socially interact. And Freud just seemed to kind of largely dismiss that. It's certainly what you're not born at all. Like, you're born with an id. If you stop there, all you got's id. It's not at all about interacting. It doesn't have any use for social anything. No awareness of others and what they might want, what rules might exist out there. And then forget the superego reasons why there's rules and morality. Okay? So, yeah, Adler comes along and says, yeah, this is innate, but it's an innate socialization, not just an innate idness. Okay? So, another parallel with Freud, but differing, is, talk of mothers and how they they develop or hinder those social interests. And we already kind of talked about that. Mothers and other caretakers can pamper, which has got its detrimental effects, or they can neglect on the other extreme and have its negative And then hopefully, most mothers are going to be nice and healthy somewhere in the middle. Okay, so the effect that mothering has on this development of a social interest. Okay, all right. That all then swings us into probably, I would say, the two most widely known things about Adler. If people can name two things about Adler, they're going to know something about inferiority and complexes. That term's going to sound, familiar to most students of psychology. Eventually, if I come and ask you, 20 years from now, what do you remember about, your degree in psychology? What do you remember about Adler? You're going to probably remember something about inferiority complexes, and he was really, really into birth order. Birth order really mattered to him. Okay, so those are his two biggies. So, Adler, the sequence of your birth, it had a huge bearing on your style of life, your personality. Okay. So, these are, so he kind of breaks it up into, firstborn, secondborn, and by secondborn that can really mean middleborn. Okay, so some of you, we all are going to fall in here somewhere. Okay, so you're either a firstborn, maybe an only, maybe you're in the last category, you're the first and only. But he had, there's differences between onlys and firstborns. Okay, so then there's youngest child, or youngest child doesn't necessarily literally have to mean the youngest child in Adler's world. Okay. So if you had big families where there's lots of second and lots of youngest, okay, so you can be kind of, closer to the youngest or be the youngest, or you can be, there's first and there's, first is first. You get what I'm trying to say here? But the middles kind of have to, can be somewhere between second and youngest. Yeah. I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
What if you're one of your parents firstborn and one of your parents second?
Then it gets complicated. Yeah, now, so Adler wasn't living in a world where that kind of thing was nearly as common as it can be today, right? So now we got okay, yeah. So what would Adler say today? I don't know. I would probably say, yeah, one of them is probably one of them happened earlier. So whatever was earlier, your earlier experience. So he's largely talking about early influences. I mean, by the time you're 25, whether or not you're first, second, third, or whatever, probably isn't going to be continuing to shape yourself. But these are okay, when you were, okay, if you were, you're the firstborn, okay, you're the firstborn, okay. If it turns out then you wind up being the only, okay, now you're in your own category of only child, okay. Now you described maybe eventually then parents get remarried or whatever, and now suddenly you were first, now you're second. So I'm sure he would say, when did it happen? So if you were firstborn and you were the firstborn, and maybe I don't know if you're talking about yourself or just in general, but anyway, if you're the firstborn, regardless whether you have younger kids or not, then your parents got remarried, and now suddenly you're in third place. Depends on what age you were. So if that didn't happen until you were 5, well, you had 5 good golden years of being first. That's what would have shaped you. If you were first for 8 months, and then all of a sudden, then the next thing is going to be the thing that shaped you more. Does that answer the question, kind of?
Yeah.
So, I think that's what Adler said. I'd have to channel him to find out for sure. That seems logical, though. Okay, so anyway, what are some of the things that he says about these different categories? All right, so firstborn children. And now, when I look at these things, I do see some sort of inconsistencies, and I'm like, well, which is it? I mean, because anyway. Some of these seem like sort of no-brainer, and some of these, again, this stuff enters our social language and our, culture, and yeah, this isn't the first time you're ever like, oh, the birth order makes a difference. I'm sure if you've been talking about it in your family, whether you're the first, second, third, or only, okay? So these are not brand new things you've never heard of before. Okay, so anyway, firstborns, they're the focus of attention. That makes logical sense, right? Firstborn, parents, you spend all this, your firstborn. I mean, you just look at how parents respond to a firstborn, and it just greatly differs than how they respond to even the second, and certainly by the time the fourth comes along. Okay? The firstborn kid, you're just so obsessed with the parenting. Very often, this is a common, again, there's people that pamper, there's people that neglect, and everything in between, okay? So on the pampering side of things, you often see this some obsession with the firstborn, and you're so obsessed with their care, and you don't let other people handle them because that's on germs, and I don't want them to get sick, and oh, don't put that in your mouth. The pacifier falls out and falls on the ground, and like, whoop, we got to back up, sterilized and clean. Okay, all right, and so the firstborn, you got a whole bag full of those things, right? Sterilized. Okay. By the time the fourth comes along, you're like, huh. Okay, you get the idea. All right, so yeah, firstborn's going to get that focus of attention, that special care, because it's the new, we're caring for the first time for a baby and learning all the, rules, and maybe overlearning some of the rules, and then you get more relaxed, you get more used to having the kid around, you get more tired of having the kid around by the time others come along. And so, yeah, firstborn's getting all the attention, okay? And then if there are subsequent, if you don't want to become the only, if you become the only, well, that just stays. You're the focus until your parents die, and then you still think you're the focus of the world. Okay, but that's gonna, sooner or later, if another kid's gonna come along, they're gonna kind of knock you off the throne a little bit, and you're now in a battle to regain supremacy. So that's a common thing he says about firstborns. Okay. They tend to mature faster, become more intellectual than some of the others. They tend to be more organized, he says, more authoritarian, rule-abiding. This is, they learned all these rules. They learned, hey, when that falls on the ground, you don't pick it up, put it in your mouth. Okay, they got, the parents are just, enforcing rule. Everything's rules. Okay, so they grow up to become very rule, authoritarian oriented. Okay. Oddly, though this seems a little inconsistent, they become very conscientious. They tend to be more conscientious than other siblings tend to be. That to me needs a little explanation. Like, where does that come from? Okay, that one doesn't fit as clearly in my way of thinking. All right? They tend to be insecure and then kind of hostile dominant. So they're going to tend to kind of wind up being in that first style of life, that dominant category, a little bit more likely, right? They dominate over the others. They're, these are mine. These other little kids in the house, I was here first. These are my toys and my things and my parents. You guys are mine. They become dominant, maybe even hostile. And that extends in Adler's life world to, not just within the family. So, again, everything's about inferiority and insecure feelings. And so, yep, right there, all the kids come along and they just nail you with inferiority. That just hits you like a brick. Suddenly you're like, wow, I'm not the center of the world. Okay? I got some coping to do. All right? All right. How many of you are firstborns? What do you think? Yes? No? Love it? Hate it? Any thoughts? I'm doing all the talking. Please share. Firstborns, I want to hear only from firstborns right now. Or if you got okay, you can speak if you've got a firstborn in your family, it's like you want to share about. Let me hear about firstborns. Come on. Yeah.
The firstborn of my family is the exact opposite of all.
Really? Okay.
I mean, she got a lot of attention and stuff like that, but the characteristics is completely opposite.
All right. Not intellectually mature?
Maybe insecure and lost, but everything else, yeah, she's...
Right? Adler's rolling in his grave. You're not the firstborn. You're the fourthborn. Who's the firstborn? Let me hear from the firstborn. Let me hear your thoughts. Firstborn is. Yeah. Well, what? Huh? You're just the firstborn. Okay. Do you agree or disagree with some of this? Is there anything that you agree with? Anything that you disagree? Anything that you recognize that you want to share, you recognize about yourself? Or anything that you say, you know what? No, that's not good. Are you hostile?
I think it is a little bit.
All right. Anything in particular that fits you? And maybe think in terms of like how you interact with your other siblings.
Just the way I interact with my other siblings, the mindset that I have, like everybody else,
Okay.
like I have that firstborn, I'm in charge type of
Okay.
mentality.
All right.
And I always pretend that there's something
The others tend to look at you as like when there's unsureness or decisions that need to be made, like, oh, what do you say? What do you think? Or, okay. I'll tell you what, I am going to skim forward. I just realized I'm kind of getting close in time. I do want you to talk about something. So let me wrap this up, and then I want you guys to at least talk with each other if you won't talk to me. Okay? All right, secondborns, what do they like? Okay? They, like I think we were just hinting at, they tend to look at the oldest sibling as the sort of pace setter. Okay, when you're not sure what to do, you look to the oldest sibling. How to, what do they do? What did they do when they were, when they encountered this thing or this situation? Okay, that competition spurs, that feeling of inferiority spurs competition and compensating for things that you feel inferior about. So you're going to learn language faster. You're going to tend to have motor skills develop sooner and quicker because you see that older sibling doing all this stuff better than you, and I can do it too. And so they didn't have that sort of pressure other than the parents. But yeah, there's something really different. There's something about looking at adults when you're a little kid and recognizing like, well, they're grown-ups, they're adults. But when you look at another kid that's maybe only a year or two older than you, it's like, hey, if they can do that, I can do that too. You're mad when you see them get privileges that you don't get because you're not old enough. So it tends to spur you along and push you along at a faster pace than that oldest child did. Okay? That probably leads to an optimism. So, right, all those feelings of inferiority, and then you drive past them, and you do become better and quicker at these things. So it builds an optimism. They tend to be more optimistic as people. Competitive, like I said, ambitious for all those same reasons. Okay, but at the same time, then he says like, okay, but you might wind up being an underachiever. Okay, so maybe you're that, avoidant category. You know what? It's like, I can't compete with that. Underachiever and proud of it. Okay, I can't compete with the golden girl or the golden boy. All right, so it can swing completely in the other direction. Youngest kids, what do they like? They're the pets, right? How many of you got a youngest kid in the family? They're the pet. You call them the pet. Okay? You got names for them that sound like pet names. All right? They do develop at a fast pace, probably for those same reasons as the second-borns do. And again, second-borns can be like in a big family, third, fourth born, okay? At some point you kind of have this fuzzy border between youngest can mean second youngest, third youngest, you got 10 people in the family. You can't just talk about second and youngest, you got a whole bunch in between you got to describe, okay? So yeah, because of and the more older siblings you have, and the older those older siblings are, and to the extreme that if they're very much older, they can become like parents. I got a brother who's 12. I always say I got a 12-year-old brother. I will always call him a 12-year-old brother because he's 12 years younger than me, and he's just always going to be 12. Okay, he's 3 inches taller than me, and he looks like he's a model from GQ, but he's going to be 12. God damn it! All right. So anyway, he grew up with 4 older siblings, so he had 6 parents in the house. Okay, so that shaped his personality, no doubt. Having 12 to how how old is my oldest sister than him? 16, 17 years older. Okay, so by the time he's 5, we're all kind of young adults. So in and out of the house, So that shaped his personality greatly. The youngest tend to be high achievers. They also tend to be more dependent and helpless because of all of that pampering and help they might have gotten. The more older those older siblings are, the more they can do some of that caring for you and pampering. Let me pick that up. You can't do it. You're too little. You little helpless slug. Okay, so you get pampered. Okay, what are the only childs like? Center of the universe. Okay, how can they not be? How can they not be? Especially when especially with the pampering, if that's the style of the parenting. Okay, so the pampered child. Okay, not saying every only child gets pampered, but when there's excessive pampering, then they're really the center of the universe, not just the solar system or the galaxy, the universe. Okay. They're spending, basically all their time with adults. There's no other little kids in the house to play with. Now again, these things are like traditional families and traditional times, okay? So we're not talking about blended families and families that live with extended family. All rules are off. I mean, we're talking about like what's the situation when you got mom and dad and one or more siblings in one unit of the house. That's the world Adler's describing here. Okay. Because they're always around adults, they're going to be mature earlier. They're not modeling their behavior off of other kids. They're modeling it after adults. And that's going to lead to resentment and disappointment when they discover in situations when the universe does not revolve around them. Okay, so we only got a little bit of time left here, and maybe next time I'll talk more about, I want to talk next time about some other stuff. So let me jump forward to what I want to do today. All right, so I want you to pull up into the little piles of 3, 4, 5 people, and with the 10, 15 minutes we got left, I want you to describe your family table. Dinner time, okay? Family dinner time. When you're 6, when you were 13, and what it would be like now. So kind of visualize yourself floating above these people, including yourself, looking down from the ceiling at these 3 different times in your lifetime. And describe what is being discussed. What's going on at this table? Who's talking? What are they talking about? What do you like? What are your siblings like if you have siblings? If you're an only child, what was that like? So do that, and I'm going to leave this up on the screen here as you do that. These are sort of like the highlights of what those categories, what goes on there. So I had a question. No, I'm not going to have you write this down today. So, so gather up right now and share some of these experiences with 1, 2, 3 other people. Go. We don't have much time. In other words, kind of talk about what it was like and what it's like now to be where you are in the family. Talk about yourself and your siblings if you have them in terms of Adler's stuff.